Hey listeners, just a heads up. While we always keep our language PG, we are discussing a show that is rated TV-MA, and as a result, though we don't get into specifics, we do talk about sex. And so if you're listening with your children or your parents, you might want to save this for another time. Thank you.
Category is.
Oh, we should do that. The category is. Well, that could be like we can insert that somewhere.
The joys of audio editing.
That right there, what you said, like, I want us to do that at the beginning, then that's where we should edit it in, is at the beginning.
Yes.
Okay, and before okay.
I got you. This will all be the outtake for the beginning, and then we'll just have the theme music come in.
Yeah. Welcome to this episode of Culture Popped Open. Today we're popping open the first season of Pose from FX, the network. You may be wondering why now it's a year old, but for one thing, season 1 is now on Netflix, and season 2 is currently airing, and we're watching it, but we're not going to talk about it right now. As of recording, we've only seen 4 episodes, or only 4 have aired, and it also has been renewed for a 3rd season. Basically, I watched it last year, and I made Tay watch it since it appeared on Netflix. And I was like, we need to talk about this.
Olivia's like the head TV person at this podcast, so if she has something that she thinks I should watch, I basically just watch it and then start taking notes.
Yeah, and I will say, like, FX has been one of the main places that has a ride that's not cable for what we call prestige TV. I mean, I don't know if Ryan Murphy is always in that camp, because he's seen as more, like, I don't know, I guess less serious than some of the other major shows, and definitely, I don't know, has a broader appeal, but definitely a creative force. Ryan Murphy created the show. It's his last show for FX and Fox, which he's basically been on forever. Like, I think he started with Nip Tuck and Glee, which is like 10 years ago. And then Brian Falchuk, who he usually collaborates with, is also on, but Stephen Canals is also on this, and he's a queer person of color who knows the ball scene and also is married to a trans woman. I want to quote this interview from Murphy that was in the Pride edition of, or the special Pride issue of Entertainment Weekly, had Pose on the front cover. And it had this interview in it, like, it was basically the cover story about the show, and this was really what I learned what the show was about, because those season 1 trailers were just confusing to me. It was just kind of like fancy costumes. So, a few things about why this show is important. Murphy is putting his money where his mouth is by donating all of his profits from Pose to LGBTQ charities. And he sees that he's kind of been rewarded for being gay, and he wants to get back because he's done all these other shows. The only other major Murphy show I've seen is American Crime Story, both seasons, as a disclaimer. So, typically, leaders of their writers' rooms, Murphy and Falchuk defer to those with life experience in this world, like Canals and Janet Mock. This has been the most uncomfortable and exciting creative experience and probably life experience I've had, admits Falchuk, 47. It has been a great opportunity for me to understand my own privilege and my own power in the system that has encouraged me. And then lastly, Stephen Canals talks about how anyone who would say that there isn't enough trans talent out there has not tried and is not looking hard enough. There's an abundance out there that is untapped. Pose boasts more than 140 transgender actors and crew, including Janet Mock and Our Lady J, who are both significant writers and are producers and writers on the show. And Janet Mock also directs and became the first trans woman of color to write and direct an episode, which was Love is the Message, perhaps the best episode in season 1. So basically, every Hollywood movie that has attempted to explain why they cast a cis guy, looking at the Danish Girl seems like the most obvious, but I know there's a bunch more. In a trans woman's role, there are people out there. Stop making excuses.
The excuse I hear most often in terms of that is realism in terms of the transition process. And I'm like, 1, that's nonsense. And also, 2, I feel like that just provides a really limited view of the gender binary and what's possible with TV and film production. And second, there's ways around that. Like, I remember Orange is the New Black. They used her twin brother to do, like, the pre-transition
Yeah, I mean, that's like a special case, but still. There aren't really flashbacks. I mean, the one flashback of Blanca is just she has, like, a short wig on.
Yeah.
And, like, you really don't... It shouldn't matter, I guess, as much. And I think it's just cis people are obsessed with that.
Yes.
And then also people are like, oh, it needs to have this major actress. And, like, all of these actresses, like, I don't think they've been on anything major. But, like, they're great. So now people know who they are, and they still watch them. So...
Although it's interesting because, like, I saw MJ in Rent, and, like, oh my god, it's Angel, and she was one of my most, like, favorite Angels I've seen in a production of Rent.
Electra, she is someone who actually, she's the older one. She's, like, the oldest of the cast, and so she talks about how she kind of grew up with the ball scene. Yeah, MJ also made headlines when she auditioned for Peggy in Hamilton. My question is, did the show get popular through Billy Porter's costumes?
Yes. His appearances at the Met Gala have been incredible these past years.
And then also the Oscars and, like, everything.
And the Tonys.
Yeah. Yeah, 2 years. Yeah, because there were basically, like, 2 award seasons, right?
Yes.
Or no, it was, like, 1 long year.
But my thing is, okay, so Billy Porter arguably is the reason that Pose became popular, but does the fact that he led to its popularity also lead to the eclipsing of the actual trans people of color who are driving the show?
Yeah, because, so I feel like he wasn't as prominent in previews for the first season, and then I also feel like he's just not a major character. He got nominated for Best Leading Actress for the Emmys, I think, last year, and that doesn't make sense to me.
Oh, also, did you know that his part originally didn't exist in the concept for the series?
Okay, well, you have to have someone announcing the balls.
Well, no, but they didn't have that role. So he auditioned to play Helena at the dance school, knowing that it was the wrong part for him, and then he basically begged Ryan Murphy to be in the show, and they wrote the role, Pray Tell, specifically for him.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that character is definitely based on various MCs. Like in Paris is Burning, it's very much the same kind of tone and performance.
Yes.
In the background even, like you still hear it all the time. Someone else was originally cast in that. Actually, I'm going to look it up real fast. Tatiana Maslany. She was originally cast as the dance teacher, but they changed her part into that of a 50-year-old African-American woman. So that's what happened.
Do you want to talk about Paris is Burning?
Yeah, I can talk about Paris is Burning. So the major pop culture reference point for Pose is Paris is Burning, a documentary by Jenny Livingston, who is a white queer person. So there's a lot of controversy actually about not just her like lens on the situation, but also how they didn't actually get paid as much as they thought they should have, so there's a big controversy about that. Here people are getting paid, which is great.
Jenny is also a consulting producer on the show.
Yeah, I mean, she did, like, research.
I was just pointing that out because you can see the influence of Paris is Burning on Pose.
Yeah, especially if you've seen the season 2 previews, where it's, like, structured, like, interviews, and it's black and white, like the Vogue video. Yeah, but basically the ballroom scenes are, like, a more extravagant version of what you see in there. What the documentary, how it's like structured and stuff, there's like various interviews with important people, and it kind of follows them for a while. So like one of them actually is found dead by the end of the documentary, which is upsetting. It talks about like what is voguing, what is realness, what is shade, which is not internet culture. It originates from this community.
There's a lot of white queer culture that has come about in the past few years that is actually just appropriated AAVE culture, and we as a community need to be better about recognizing where some of the phrases that we come from and not using them out of respect for the community that created them.
Very well, and I think Damon in the first season, and the first episode especially, your window into all of that because he's new to this world, and so Blanca has to explain, and like what is reading and stuff like that. Which This, I really didn't learn much new at all, because it's really all integrated into the show.
Yes. I am looking because I saw in an interview a quote about the costumes being different in Paris is Burning, and I'm trying to find it now.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pose definitely looks more professional, especially the ballroom looks more glitzy. Like, the other one, you can kind of tell they were kind of in a gym.
Well, the quote I saw, and I will find it somewhere and link it in the show notes, was basically the idea that the costumes weren't as glitzy in the actual balls.
Mm-hmm.
It was much more gritty and not as put together. But the whole idea is that Pose as a show indulges in the fantasy of how these queens saw themselves. And the way that the costumes reflects the fantasies of the queens and how they saw themselves. And I think there's something really special about how they use the budget that they have and the power that they have as a TV show in order to indulge in that idea.
Yeah, and I think the show as a whole, which we'll definitely talk about, does embrace quite a bit of hope and, like, love and family, instead of just being like, oh, look at these sad people, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That I feel like a lot of outside reflections on this time period and this community do. Also, that is, like, one connection I can make to the Ryan Murphy American Crime Story that I've seen, because it definitely, and almost to, like, a funny extent, like, a humorous tone with music especially. So, like, in the first season, it opens with them stealing some clothes from an exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum. There's also a sequence later on set to Christmas music where Electra, Candy, and Lulu steal money from a Salvation Army tin on Fifth Avenue, which is very ironic and funny because the Salvation Army is known for being anti-LGBTQ and discriminatory, especially towards, like, trans people in their shelters. So that was great. So there's, like, also stuff like that that's more tongue-in-cheek and humorous and, like, overblown. And I think you also see that to an extent in the ball scenes. So, like, American Crime Story has this scene in the first season where Johnny Cochran dresses up OJ's house. Again, a humorous musical cue to look like he has a bunch of, like, African-American historical things instead of, you know, OJ's picture golfing with white people and, like, with, like, scantily clad white women and stuff like that to make it appealing to the jurors. So that's a style comparison I saw.
And also, tagging on to this idea of the Brooklyn Museum heist, I got so obsessed with this show that the week I started watching it, I went to the Brooklyn Museum to, like, see all the different places where they filmed. When I was watching the show, what actually tipped me off that they were in the Brooklyn Museum was the elevator. And the way that the posters were hung up in the elevator, I'm like, I know that place. That's the Brooklyn Museum. But I think, the ability for them to have the budget to film on location in all of these places is really special, too, because filming in New York City is expensive.
Yeah, this is his most expensive show.
So the fact that they filmed on location at the Brooklyn Museum is really cool, although it raises questions about the role of museums and how museums get entangled in popular culture and other things that aren't art history related, and that's a whole art historian discussion that we're not going to get into. But then also they filmed in Washington Square Park, I know. They filmed the bar where Blanca goes and gets excluded from is a gay bar called Julius in the Village that is still there, and they filmed inside and outside of it as well. They filmed a lot at the Chelsea Square Diner.
That's the one diner they always go to?
Yes. Yeah. And then, although the other one looks like the Washington Square Diner, so I'm not sure if they filmed there too, or if all diners in the Village just kind of look the same and it's hard to distinguish them. They also filmed on set at Indochine, which is a restaurant where Electra gets a job at a hostess. So it's cool to see all of these New York City places, and definitely when I was watching the first season on Netflix, I was pausing and, like, trying to, like, zoom in and see where they were filming. And I'm also pretty sure I was in Washington Square Park when they were filming some of the episodes from the first season. They film a lot there, but I'm always annoyed because then I have to walk all the way around the park.
Which hospital are they in the first season? I feel like it was St. Vincent's.
It's not St. Vincent's.
Okay. It's one of the ones, but not the famous one.
I think they were in a hospital in Long Island City in season 1.
I mean, I meant, like, in the story, not, like, where they filmed it.
No, I mean, I think
it's
the only time St. Vincent's gets mentioned in season 1 is when Blanca gets diagnosed.
Yeah, okay.
The doctor tells her to go to St. Vincent's.
Okay, that must have been what I was thinking of.
So St. Vincent's was the famous hospital, or infamous hospital, where a lot of AIDS patients went, and there was a lot of protests and kiss-ins in the emergency room, which you can see if you watch another AIDS documentary, How to Survive a Plague. That documentary is great. But St. Vincent's is closed now. It's still a hospital, but it's a different one. And the New York City AIDS Memorial is in the little park in front of it. I might have a section in the show notes of, like, places you can visit in New York City if you're interested in, like, reliving some of the history from the show.
All right.
I also love how they filmed the scenes in Washington Square Park, because some of the NYU buildings weren't there in 1987 when the first season takes place. So they, like, strategically placed the camera to, like, block out the law school building.
We like behind the scenes. Okay, let's move on to the stories and the character and their different storylines, because that's the bulk of this episode.
Yeah. Although if you've been listening to Culture Popped Open, you know that we tend to get lost in the weeds of the theory, behind-the-scenes stuff. But we're trying.
That's what's fun.
The category is... Okay, let's talk about characters.
Do you want to talk about the opening, or can we move on?
I'll talk about the opening briefly. So I was thinking last night about the opening credit thing for Pose. So if you've seen the show, they usually have like a few minutes and then they'll break into the opening credit. It's Billy Porter's voiceover going, the category is Live, Work, Pose. And I realized last night that's a pun off of Live, Work, Play. And thinking about how play, entertainment, and performativity are these themes that are just so overarching in the show. So I always like that that's inserted there in the show. And that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, so the category is Blanca and the House of Evangelista versus Electra and the House of Abundance, which is this major overarching plot, the underdog versus the, I guess, top dog. What's the opposite of underdog? The reigning champions, but also with a personal bent, because Blanca, who is a fairly young trans woman who has just been diagnosed with HIV, separates from her house mother, Electra, who is an older trans woman, and they all live together. That's what the house scene is. And goes off to start her own house and be her own mother. They compete against each other, and it's this whole rivalry.
Yeah.
Based very much on the structure of the ball scene, which we already described quite a bit, I think.
I think so, but just to recap, if you've never seen the show, or if you're confused about the show, so they have these balls where they prepare, and they have different categories that they have to compete in. So there's face categories, there's costume categories, there's body categories, and then there's a panel of judges that judge each performance. But there's also
kind of arbitrarily.
There's also audience participation, and it's definitely not like a rigid set of rules. Yeah,
no, it's just meant to feel like they can really pass in the real world in a way as their fantasy. So whether that means butch queen or whether that means, face model, that's where Vogue came from.
Although they also have bizarre categories, and that causes interesting implications in the show later in the season. And they'll have a Valentine's Day ball, which is the Cupid ball. They have a snowball. And it's also just meant to be a community space for these people who don't have anywhere else that they feel like they can belong.
And that's what the houses are, too. Like, in exchange for competing with someone, you live with them, and they help provide for you, and you help provide for them, and you live together. And they're essentially your mother, because a lot of these people were forced out of their homes, as Blanca was, as Damon is at the very beginning of the first episode.
Candy was.
Yeah, I mean, that's implied.
Yeah.
But the ones we see are those. Yeah.
And then also, what I think is so interesting about the houses is that even though all of the houses follow this basic structure of we take care of you, you compete for us system, there's definitely different values that are respected in each house. Like, Electra is definitely like the cutthroat, not warm and fuzzy mother.
Yeah, like, I'm the best.
Yes.
And then Blanca has her strict rules, but ultimately, because she loves them and also actually looks out for them.
Yes. And wants to make sure that they're educated and not getting into trouble. in various ways. And then Lulu and Candy's house, I think, is one of the most interesting setups because
they revolt against Elektra later on and start their own house.
Yeah, so Candy and Lulu are also some of Elektra's children, and they go off and start a house, but they don't really have money.
So basically by the end of the season, Elektra is the only one left of the trans women because, like, Blanca and Angel went to join Blanca, and then Candy and Lulu went off on their own thing. So
yeah. There's a lot of house drama of people who are in houses for a while, kind of learning the ropes, and then their mother pisses them off, and then they go off and start their own house. And I feel like that also reflects a lot of the politics of gentrification and housing accessibility in this, too, because when Blanca starts her own house, she gets, like, a roach-infested apartment uptown.
Yeah.
I think it's in the Bronx, in the Heights, or Harlem, which were areas that had much cheaper rent than they do today 30 years ago because of color lines in the city and implied racial segregation through urban neighborhoods, which is a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
I don't know where Elektra's apartment is. Oh, I do. It's, hers is, like, upper Midtown in Hell's Kitchen near the Upper West Side.
Okay.
In real life, I don't know where it is in the show, only because there's a very specific building that you can see out the view of her apartment that makes me know exactly where it is in New York City. And then I don't know.
It's probably green screen, you know.
I mean, it's a very specific view that they picked that made me believe it's not green screen, because if it was green screen, they would have edited that building out because it didn't exist in 1987.
Oh, okay.
This is the perks of having someone who's in New York City a lot and is always trying to, like, figure out where things are.
Anyway, the ball scenes just, like, complement the real-world scenes, as I should say.
Yes.
Like, they play off each other. It's not just a competition show. You get to see everything that they bring each week and how it relates to their real life.
Yeah.
And also, I think the judging is weirdly arbitrary. Like, it's either all 10s or, like, 6s and 7s.
Or they have, like, 2 competitors that they really like, and then, like, the last person is always the 9.
Yeah, and also the MC is not at all unbiased.
I was thinking about that a lot during season 1. I'm like, pray tell us the judge, but, like, he literally hangs out with Blanca, like, every week.
I know, I also think about, well, not just that, but also when he's, like, complaining about them as they walk down, and he's not a judge, he's the MC. But yeah, he does, like, he helps make clothes for Blanca, which I guess isn't an inter-house problem, because he's not in a house, but also he's, like, running the show. But they're friends, so whatever.
But, I mean, he runs the show, but he's not necessarily judging, but he does have an influence in the judging decisions.
That's what I think. I don't know if he's supposed to, but he does.
I don't know if that's, like, a pray-tell character thing or, like, a Billy Porter character thing.
No, I also think it's just, like, what that role is.
Yeah.
Based on what I remember from Paris is Burning, too. Okay. Also, all of this is very much played on the found family idea that we all love and is inherent in queer life. I
mean, that's just, like, my favorite thing about the show. I think that's the engine that makes the show go.
Yeah, like, here's the thing. I watched the first episode of the first season, you know, back around when it came out. I think there were a couple episodes out already. And I watched it, and, like, by the end of this episode, I was, like, really rooting for them. Like, at that point, there were 4 of them. Little Poppy just, like, appeared.
Yeah,
at the end of that episode.
By the end of the first episode, you know that House of Evangelista is Blanca, Damon, Angel, and Little Poppy.
Yeah, and I already love all of them.
Yeah. I
will die for them.
You.
Yeah, although I think Little Poppy gets a glow up in season 2. I think he's definitely more of a prominent character and more, like, influential and better. Okay, moving on.
The category is Little Poppy. His major arc in season 1 happens towards the end, where he basically gets caught selling drugs and then gets kicked out of House of Evangelista and then joins House of Ferocity.
I forgot about that. Okay.
Wait, does he join House of Abundance at the end of season 1, or is he still in House of Ferocity? Or does he come back to House of Evangelista? There's some people who hop around the houses, and I'm like, I don't know where
you are. Back.
Okay, yeah.
I didn't rewatch the last 4 episodes of season 1. So I was like, oh, I remember enough now.
There's a lot that goes on in the very last episode, and you could very much tell that they were kind of tying the episode up in, like, a neat little bow.
And then they got renewed.
And then they got renewed, and then that definitely caused problems with, like, the plotting and pacing in season 2, but we're not going to talk about that now. But that's my major complaint about the show.
They needed to move to 2 years later for reasons, and it doesn't always make sense.
I'm like, are they going to jump 2 years ahead after the end of season 2?
Yes.
That could be interesting.
After the end of season 2. I don't know, it depends what happens, because I feel like they jumped to 1990 for Act Up and Vogue reasons. So Poppy is adorable, but also deals drugs. And then I guess that doesn't always come up. It comes up, like, pretty clearly at the very beginning when he first is there, like, in the second episode. But then I think it kind of drops off, and then it becomes, like, a big problem. Then it becomes, like, a question of, like, who is allowed to snitch and stuff like that.
Yeah, like loyalty politics. It's Ricky who spills the beans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ricky is Damon's boyfriend, who then joins the house.
Which is complicated. There's a lot of complicated social politics in the show, especially season 1.
I do have a question. Do you think Little Poppy is bi? I just dropped. Okay. Because he says he's an equal opportunity lover, but then he also says he only was with a couple guys because he needed to make money. So
we don't know how equal opportunity is there. He might be. I'm still waiting for his character to develop more. But more on that when we talk about season 2.
Damon. Damon's like the first major introduction that you see, I feel like, who isn't, in the sense that he isn't involved because he's from, like, Allentown.
Yes.
And he goes to ballet class because his mother's like, he really wants to be a dancer, and his mother lets him, but only if he doesn't tell his father, and then his father catches him dancing and getting off the bus from dance and finds out that he is gay, and his mother also agrees that he can't be gay, and so they literally throw him out, and he gets on a bus to New York, and is homeless for a little bit.
That's our introduction to the street dancing scene in Washington Square Park, which still very much exists today. You see a lot of young musicians and artists of color who do various street dancing and acts in the park all the time. And that's how Blanca finds him. She forces him to join her house.
Not force exactly.
I mean,
but, like, gives a very strong offer. And then she introduces him to the balls and also introduces the audience to the balls in that way. And he's literally, like, just a 17-year-old who is discovering everything for the first time. And he gets to go to dance school at the new school, which I'm pretty sure in their contemporary dance program.
Yeah. And they actually filmed the rehearsal scenes and the audition scene on location at the dance school in Hell's Kitchen. And, okay, so Damon gets to go to dance school because of Blanca.
Because Blanca sweet-talks the teacher.
The dean, not just the teacher. She sweet-talked the dean.
That's what I meant. But she's also the teacher. Like, she teaches the classes and stuff. Because he kind of didn't fill out his application. Like, he kind of just doesn't believe he's worth anything.
Which is understandable, considering his character arc. And his character arc is very much about, like, self-love.
Yeah, I love the dance scenes.
I was just going to say about the dancing that in the recap, Brian Moylan, who did the recaps for Vulture, was very unimpressed with Damon's audition scene.
I love that scene.
And I am going to respectfully disagree and just argue that he didn't understand any of the show and actual, like, young queer culture that was represented in the show, especially
like dance, ballroom,
and expression. And I also love the friendship that formed between the dance scene and Blanca, even though it felt kind of unrealistic.
They respect each other.
Yes.
And then he also goes to the piers and sees the dancing and meets Ricky, who is, like, his first real love and relationship.
And watching them, like, slowly get together was so painful, so wonderful, and also relatable.
And then Blanca's like, okay, I'm gonna tell you about gay sex. Seriously. He's like, no.
Which, again, I think links back to the whole found family theme and how in the queer community you often have these older mentors who have to catch up the younger people because they're not getting this information from other sources.
Yeah, exactly.
And then also how Pray Tell mentors the young queer men in the show about HIV and HIV testing.
That's our next category. So the AIDS epidemic, probably a pretty well-mined area of pop culture is New York AIDS epidemic. But I don't know, I feel like the show does it pretty well.
I think that the AIDS epidemic has been pretty well represented in plays, TV, movies, documentaries, as long as the people who have HIV and AIDS in those representations are white.
To an extent, I think.
But I definitely feel like this show highlights...
Especially trans women.
Yeah.
You see a lot of gay cis men.
Because the show definitely highlights a different aspect of the AIDS epidemic that's not usually as widely represented.
But was also the community most affected.
Yes. And the most vulnerable to these issues at this time period. Because How to Survive a Plague, a bunch of gay, cis, white dudes.
And America is mostly white dudes.
The Normal Heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rent is a little more diverse.
A little. It also takes place later.
It takes place later and also addresses the drug diagnosis, like way of getting it out. I mean, I think people just have this tendency... Oh, Falsettos is another example, just to mention it because it's like my favorite musical. But I think a lot of people look at this and be like, oh, tragedy, someone's going to die and stuff like that. And I feel like the show doesn't focus on all that doom and gloom, even though it is a very serious topic that it takes seriously.
Yes.
Not as prominent in the first season either. Because the thing about Blanca is she tells Pray Tell, but she doesn't tell anyone else. No, she tells Angel at the end, right?
Yeah.
So they're the only ones who know, and then Pray Tell. So there's an episode early on, I think it's the third or fourth one, where basically Damon's upset. Blanca finds out that Damon and Ricky had sex with her, because she, like, spies on them sometimes, you know? They live in the same apartment.
Blanca's character arc is she does things out of love, and occasionally those things work out, but as season 2, that becomes more complicated, and some of her love becomes more harmful in certain ways, especially with Lil Pop. But in this case, she's right.
Right, yeah. So she finds out that there was, like, one time where the condom came out for something, and Damon has a fever, and so they're all freaking out. So, like, Pray Tell gets the boys, Ricky, Damon, because Ricky's, like, slept with a ton of people in the past, which is also part of their, like, relationship, in the sense that they come from different backgrounds in terms of relationships and maturity, and so they're still figuring stuff out. And Lil Poppy. Yes, they all go to get tested. And then Pray Tell lies and says he was also negative because all the boys are so happy and he's not. And because he kind of stopped getting tested after a while, and his partner is in the hospital.
And I think a lot of that just reflects, one, how ubiquitous HIV had become by that point in the 80s, and also this idea of, one, there not being a cure, so even if you knew, there wasn't exactly a lot that you could do about it except take AZT. And now that we know, looking back on it, that it wouldn't be 10 years until the new drugs had been tested.
1996 was when they first started going down, the death rate. Yeah.
Which you can find out more about in How to Survive a Plague, which we'll link in the show notes. Both the book and the documentary.
And then also there's this part where they're sitting in that cafe and they're talking about it, and, you know, they're giving kind of an education lesson about it, or they talk about, like, how they could have maybe got it and stuff. So, like, and that's when Lil Poppy says he's, like, an equal opportunity lover or whatever. So there you can see this miseducation and how little they knew, whether, even if, like, the scientists knew and stuff, maybe.
The scientists did not know anything either at this point.
Yeah, I didn't think so. So someone's like, oh, you can't get it from women. And then someone says you can only get it if you bottom, like receive. So those are both false things.
Yeah.
But they don't know. And that's how it kind of exposed that without making it into some sort of, like, wink wink or, like, but it was historically accurate.
It's historically accurate, and it just all feels very honest and respectfully done. And this is what happens when you have people in the community who are actually affected by these things represented in the historical fiction that you make about these people.
Yeah.
Yay! In the interview with Billy Porter from Vulture, there's this really great quote where the interviewer is, Pray Tell's character tries to find some joy and at least still being alive. And they're talking about the whole Costas storyline where Pray Tell's lover passes away from age-related complications in season 1, and him finding out that he's positive. And Billy Porter replies, "That's what I did. That's all of us everywhere. We're not the only one with hardships. Do you choose to wallow and give in and give up? Or do you choose life?" That's what this show is about, watching a group of people choosing life. Hopefully that will be inspiring to somebody. So I just wanted to, insert that and think about how it's also clear how much the actors themselves think respectfully and thoughtfully about what they're doing and how they're representing it on the show.
So you just spoke to my whole postmodern theory there. Well, basically, I was really obsessed with Rent freshman year of high school, and then I took my Literary History 3 class, and we talked about postmodernism and a lot of the hallmarks of postmodernism, like breaking the fourth wall and wordplay and stuff, and, pastiche appears in Rent. So I was thinking about it as I was, walking around campus listening to it, and I think the show does a similar thing. So, one of the hallmarks of postmodernism is that it can also, focus on diverse voices and diverse perspectives, which I think both of these things do, especially this show, especially, challenging the master narrative. So, if the master narrative about the AIDS crisis in the 80s from, the people high up and the people in, middle America or whatever, was that it was these people who deserved it because they did drugs or they were gay or whatever, and that they were doomed to die. And as we look back on it, what a tragedy it was, representing these things, which is pretty explicit in, I think, the lyrics and also the ending of Rent. And as you mentioned in the show with that Billy Porter quote, how this embraces instead of death life. And yeah, that's my theory, that it challenges the master narrative of the AIDS crisis to make it about life instead of death.
Yes. And I think you see that pattern in a lot of more recent AIDS media, too.
I would say Angels in America as well.
Yeah. Not so much The Normal Heart, but The Normal Heart is its own very...
Normal Heart was written earlier.
Yes.
During the whole thing, and also with lots of anger.
It was written by Larry Kramer, who I don't think is very optimistic about queer issues then or now. Because I saw him a few months ago, and he is still just as angry.
Well, you saw him speak. You didn't, run into him on the street and be like, what's your opinion?
Although he has been known to stand on the street and yell at people and be angry about things, so I wouldn't put it past him. He's wonderful. He just comes out, and everyone's like, "We respect you so much," and he's like, "We're screwed." But it was interesting seeing him talk, and he talked a lot about how the rights we have aren't permanent, and that if we don't keep fighting for them, we're going to lose them. And if we don't pay attention to the most vulnerable members of the community, and he was talking specifically about trans rights, because they were talking about the trans military ban and the trans bathroom stuff, because this was back in January. If we don't help the weakest members of our community, we'll all eventually go down.
And that's kind of what happened throughout the 80s, because gay rights had really gained traction, and the 70s were quite socially progressive with the Vietnam protests. There was the civil rights movement that led to in the women's movement, and so gay rights was also both related and also another step in that process. And then AIDS happened, and that caused so much human toll and also negative press, about this community. And that's also where the marriage fight came out of, because previously they were really out of the feminist movement. They were like, we don't know if marriage is really this thing that belongs to us, because historically it's about subjugating women or whatever. But then AIDS happened, and they're like, okay, we have no legal claim to our partners if they die, so we can't see them in the hospital. We can't, a lot of times their family would just inherit their stuff, and they would kick their partners out. So that's where a lot of the current...
And that comes up in season 2.
Yeah.
It also had a huge implication for art made by that community, and there's actually in New York City that basically went around to garbage collection nights and saved a lot of the art of artists who died.
Yeah, and I think the 80s and the early 90s of Broadway is basically just imports.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot going on, and Broadway almost died in the 90s.
Yeah.
Broadway was struggling, and then Disney came along and
Yeah, well, we have mixed feelings about that.
Yeah, that's another episode.
But The Lion King Broadway is the actual creative Disney Broadway. The category is Angel and Stan, and the two versions of the 80s that the show, the first season, plays with, which I kind of forgot about as I went back to rewatch. I was like, oh yeah, Stan is in it.
And I mean, they're kind of bringing a part of this world back in season 2, which I'm not going to talk about beyond that. Yeah, but I like how prominent. I like how prominent it is in season 1. It could become more prominent in season 2. But I think that's a really special, like, complicated and interesting storyline in season 1, which is the whole Angel and Stan.
While we're, like, on the perspective of, like, what is highlighted is Angel and all of her community rather than Stan and his community.
Yeah.
So it's basically Stan is this new, like, business person. Like, I guess that's his job. I don't know. Who goes to work.
I think he's like a entry-level, like, account manager at a financial firm.
Yeah. No, it's Trump Tower. He works in Trump Tower.
I just don't know, like, what they actually do all day.
We don't know. They go to meetings that Stan went into and says something important and then tries to ask for a raise so that he can buy Angel stuff behind his wife's back. And then his boss, who also snorts coke sometimes, is upset about it that he didn't go through him first. And his boss is James Vanderbeek.
Who's great. Like, he plays a great villain in this show.
Yeah, so Stan lives in New Jersey, has a wife and 2 kids, and his wife wants a dishwasher. And it's very much this version of the 80s that I think dominated in a way. I think back then with media coverage, and if you look at the TV shows, Dynasty and stuff like that back then, and very much politics. And then I think looking back too, I think people with fond memories of the 80s kind of think about this, which is like the whole upward mobility business side, you know?
I mean, I think it's also very specific to the New Jersey suburbs during this time period, because what they're basically documenting through Stan's storyline is white flight.
Yeah.
Where white business people would move out of the cities, and a lot of the towns by me actually started getting developed more in the 1980s as people who worked in finance and business started moving here.
Afford to move out.
Well, yeah, and also the land was cheap here back then because all of northern and central New Jersey, well, especially northern New Jersey, was a lot of, like, little vacation lake towns that got developed into massive urban suburbs, and that's where I live now.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see, like, that represented through Stan.
Also, what is his accent? Like, distinct accent.
So Stan's accent, I think, is, like, a kind of bastardization of the northern New Jersey, like, Maywood, Newark, Englewood, Hackensack area, where you have, like, that very, like, drawn-out vowel.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to hear, like, a similar accent, listen to My Chemical Romance's Welcome to the Black Parade. It's a very similar sound to, like, their voice.
What he talks like?
To, like, how he talks. And even how I talk. And I think that accent still very much exists around here.
Oh, yeah, definitely when I've been to New York, and, like, my dad never really made it out with much of a Brooklyn accent, but he does say vowels differently than we do.
And I also say vowels differently. Like, you can't really tell. And even when I do the sound editing for this, like, vowel sounds in New Jersey are very different than most other places in the country, and that's where you can really hear it. Like, all I really have to do is go to Boston and say coffee, and then no one wants to talk to me. Which happened to me in a Starbucks. Like, they were so rude to me after they found out I was from Jersey.
Oh, my God. That's just the East Coast in, like, a nutshell. Okay. But also his boss, what's his name? James Vanderbeek. Is it Matt?
I think it's Matt.
Okay.
James Vanderbeek.
James Vanderbeek says, he's like kind of makes fun of him for living in Jersey though, which I found interesting.
I mean, that still tracks.
Okay.
There's also a joke. Yeah. I think it's more about the wife and this whole, like, the rise of the New Jersey housewife culture.
Right, exactly.
Which is a very specific thing.
Yeah, but the whole, like, 80s in general, like, the rise of the religious right and, like, the nuclear family.
Although that really started in the 1950s.
No, absolutely. But I think the rise of conservatism and religious right in the 1980s tended to emphasize it.
Well, I think
that more women were working.
Yeah.
Across the board.
And you see that tension because Stan's wife ends up going back to school at the end of season 1 so that she has, like, more job options. And I think as much as we make fun of the whole New Jersey housewife thing here, actually more interested in Patty's. Is it Patty?
I think so.
I was actually more interested in, like, how the show represented her loneliness, and I actually found her to be more of a sympathetic character.
Well, yeah.
Than Stan, to a point.
Stan is not great, which we should probably talk about. I just can't decide where I fall on this. Because they definitely try, and Steve Cannell said this, they try to play up this as a love story and a love scene, especially in, like, I think episode 3, where they have a night together. And it's like, they're, like, dancing. It's funny. They're, like, having a good time. Play it as, like, a love scene that she deserves this and she doesn't, you know. There's no murderous anger. Even in the first episode, where she reveals that she's trans, he's not, like, violent or angry. So there's kind of that subversion. But there's so many tensions partially because Angel, you know, is very prepared for that, very prepared to be used like a fetish, very prepared for violence and stuff like that. And then, meanwhile, well, Stan, for one thing, has a wife and kids and lives in New Jersey. So that makes things tough enough. And then also, not to mention his boss kind of catches on, so that also causes some conflict.
But I think in that world, having an affair is kind of, like, commonplace.
Exactly. His boss brings up, like, oh, is she, like, what does she look like? And he's like, oh, I think she's Puerto Rican. And he's like, oh, not my type, but, like, exotic. Like, it's very fetishy.
Yeah. And I mean, that's also reflective of, like, how a lot of white guys around here still are. Just all right under the bus.
Right, and Stan doesn't really see it that way, but he's also not sure why he doesn't know how to explain it. And Angel kind of asks him because she wants to make sure he's, like, really properly into her. He does mention, like, being drawn to, like, a specific porn or something.
I'm pretty sure I know which one they filmed in because they filmed everything else on location, so it makes sense that they would film that on location. But it's on 8th Avenue. It's by the Port Authority bus station. So Stan goes to the store, and he finds this magazine called She-Males.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there is a part where when he goes to see her, when she's, like, behind glass, you know, the place where she's...
Oh, Show World?
Sex work, but she can't be touched. Yeah. He mentions, like, he kind of... I don't think he corrects the guy, but the guy refers to Angel with the wrong pronouns and, like...
Show World, like...
Yeah, like, oh, Angel, he's popular or something. So Stan, like, doesn't really connect that, but clearly doesn't view Angel that way. But also at the same time doesn't really understand himself. He's like, I don't think I'm gay, like, I don't understand. And he never really gets to that point because there are so many barriers in the way, and he's not willing to give it all up.
So my thing is, I don't think that Stan is a maliciously aggressive character.
No.
But his ignorance is not more, but just as damaging as hate and violence can be in a way, in terms of the emotional impact that he has on Angel.
Yes.
Because he hasn't worked out his emotional issues before trying to have a relationship with her.
Yes. And he's also just doesn't feel comfortable in her world either.
Because, God forbid, his presumably straight white guy doesn't feel comfortable for once in his life.
Although she takes him to a ball and it's just really awkward.
And of course she brings him on the night that they have the bizarre category, and like the way that they staged that and filmed that was so wonderful, where like there's like a green cast of light when he walks in, and there's all these people like dressed up in basically like grotesque, extravagant Halloween costumes.
Yeah, so it's difficult, I think, but I think it was handled. It didn't fall down a lot of those traps that it could have fell down.
I agree.
But also I'm glad that Angel gets to have someone who actually deserves her.
Yeah.
And who she deserves. Yeah.
Is that a season 2, like, teaser?
It's kind of a season 2 teaser, but also, like, a good ending note.
Yes.
To the show, I think.
Although I also want to add, I think it's interesting how the scene where Stan goes to the ball parallels when Angel goes to Trump Tower and tries to get a job there.
Oh, yeah. And literally she was like, hey, there's a wanted sign. And the lady's like, we're not hiring. Basically, we mean we don't hire you.
And just, like, the different, like, it sucks that Stan doesn't feel like he belongs, but there's really no social consequences to him not belonging there because he can just leave. Whereas Angel is trying to, like, better her standing and not have to do sex work, which is more dangerous.
Yeah, and then also, like, even compared to his wife. Like, his wife needs an education to actually, and that's what part, I feel like that's also part of why she goes back to school, so that she feels less hopeless, you know?
Well, she also basically, like, tells him the terms of their divorce are going to be that he moves out, he supports her education. And I think that speaks to, like, the loss of identity that a lot of housewives went through during this time period where their skills, talents, and interests became secondary to the other people in their life, especially her kids and then her husband.
And if you can't get a job, then it's much more difficult to leave.
Yes, which is an issue that persists with women in unhealthy relationships to this day. So I like that even though she wasn't the best person, that she still got a respectful, honestly told storyline.
Yeah. Speaking of gender, the category is gender politics between different members of the LGBT community. Most prominently in, I believe, the second episode, where basically Blanca meets Lulu. She basically goes to get a drink at what, like, is called, like, the best gay bar in the city.
Oh, she goes with Lulu.
She goes with Lulu at first, yeah. And then Lulu's like, what are you doing? We can't be here, because basically it only serves young, cis, white, gay guys. And yeah, she's like, hey, can I get a drink? And everyone's, like, really hostile to her, and they're like, okay. Like, it's not drag night. She's like, oh, I'm not in drag. She makes it her duty to come back and actually have them serve her. Like, it's basically a sit-in for her because they won't serve her. They'll serve her once with the agreement that she can leave because, according to the manager, like, this is not their clientele. And they don't think it looks good for them. And then also everyone basically attacks her at one point.
And it's interesting, too, because at one point, so it's mostly white men, but then she turns to the one black guy that's
I saw that.
at the bar. And she's like, wait, you're going to let them abuse me even though, like, we're on the same team? And he's like, I'm not on your team, basically.
Right. And so this idea that, and I think Lulu even says, like, we're, like, the bottom of the food chain.
Yeah. Which I think is interesting and important that they filmed that scene in a bar, thinking about how Stonewall, another bar fight at a gay bar, was largely instigated and propelled by trans women of color, and they were left out of the narrative for a long time.
Yeah, and including, like, The Atlantic wrote a story, or someone wrote a story for The Atlantic that was basically like, gay rights are basically over, and then people were like, yeah, like, there's the trans issues, but, like, some people in the gay community don't want trans issues to be conflated with gay issues. I'm just like, do you know anything about Stonewall?
But I think there was a lot of misinformation about Stonewall. I went to see a exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum about artists who have been working since Stonewall, and there was one where there was a correction in the New York Times that was fairly recent, about who was at Stonewall, and the correction was, we've heard that there was at least one lesbian in attendance. And that was how they, like, referred to the non-gay men that were at Stonewall. So it's been a battle to get the people who actually fought for those rights recognition for the work that they did.
Yeah, and trans identity and trans terminology has definitely changed over time, but at the same time, we shouldn't negate a lot of those things. Like, these people did exist back then. Like, literally, the people in the show who are writing and starring in it existed. So, especially Dominique Jackson.
Yes. Trans issues have only been in the media recently because of, like, legal legislation and stuff like that. But a lot of these issues are
and, like,
children. And also the whole thing with, like, ace terminology, like, being around in the 1970s and 80s versus the misconception, well, made uniform in the early 2000s, but those people existed too, and their histories have been.
Yeah, and same with, like, when you look back at, like, bisexual representation, a lot of it gets erased. Or also because, like, legally, like, if you look at the Red Scare and stuff, you were only deemed a homosexual if you had, based on your actions, quote, homosexual activity. So some of those people may have been bi. Like, we just don't. It's based on who they had sex with. So if you had sex with, like, one person of the same gender, you were deemed a homosexual by the government.
And I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but, like, what this show does and what historical fiction does. And I think there's a lot of conflict and tensions between different letters in the acronym online and in other spaces. And that definitely isn't a new thing. But I think shows like this give us tools to kind of navigate those tensions with more respect and energy, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think there's an interesting split in the show, even beyond these tensions and conflict, where you have, like, what Blanca, Angel, Electra, Lulu, and Candy experience as queer people, and then what Pray Tell, Little Poppy, Damon, and Ricky experience.
Right.
And how the show represents, like, the different issues that those two main groups experience on the show, but then also the things that bring them together, like HIV and discrimination, although in different forms. But I definitely think in the show that people like Pray Tell, Damon, Little Poppy, and Ricky have more privilege in a way, and you generally see those characters in the background partying and doing other things. Well, there's more tension with the trans women of color.
I also wonder who's doing the more emotional labor, and I feel like that's the women, but also they're the focus of the show, so it's kind of hard to...
It's true.
It's kind of hard to choose because they deliberately chose to focus on 5 trans women.
But I will say those other characters are in the background and fill out, like, other plots.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So the category is transitioning, passing, and body image, specifically in the storylines of Electra, Candy, and Angel, who we haven't talked about yet, and then also the concept of, quotes, realness.
Right. So I will say, first of all, and I have a source going to be linked in the show notes from Steve Canals, who is married to a trans woman, about how they very respectfully shot trans bodies, because a lot of times trans bodies in media, and they were also very aware that they were also shooting a trans actress. But regardless, a lot of times you see, like, the cis gaze. In other words, people are, like, fascinated about, like, what's in their pants? What about this? What about that? You know, like, so it's very respectful, and also being on a network, even though they get away with as much as they can, they don't show what we would call nudity, I guess.
I think explicit nudity is, like, the term.
They get really close. It's, like, just above the nipple. Like, that kind of thing. Like, you can tell it's shot very respectfully. And I think it also is shot with their emotions in mind. So Electra's decision to get confirmation surgery, basically, she's, like, she has a sugar daddy, basically. It's this super wealthy guy named Dick, fittingly, because he is one, she's like, hey, I'm going to get confirmation surgery, or gender reassignment surgery, or sex change, I don't know what they call it back then. So, like, he is all like, oh, I'm against this, like, we're over, and she eventually accepts that, and all of that, and how, he's like, oh, I feel like I'm getting away with something knowing that, and even though she's like, yo, we've never even done anything with it, and he's like, well, you don't want me to, and she's like, well, yeah, that's the whole point. There's a scene where it's like juxtaposed with something. I think it's a speech by Angel or something about how they're not, like, valued. And you see Electra tucking, but, like, you don't get to see anything like the Danish girl did. You know, it's very respectful. And how much pain that brings her. They don't show anybody.
They imply, and they actually, like, respectfully, like, show in general what it entails.
What it is, but, like, she's still wearing, like, a skirt.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think it's also interesting. The whole Electra storyline is interesting to me because, in general, she always prioritizes money and power.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, like, one example where she prioritized herself and what she wanted.
Yeah, and I mean, I think ultimately it's about survival.
Yeah.
She did screw over Candy and Lulu by taking all the money they stole.
That's true. I mean, it is about survival, but I also think it's interesting how the show presents a complicated portrayal of it, where it's this thing that's incredibly emotionally empowering for her, but ironically it also ends up costing her the same pattern of activity that she's always used to support herself, which was kind of capitalizing on men's fetishization of her body in order to get
and her attractiveness. And she also, like, makes fun of Blanca and everyone for not passing. She's like, I pass and you don't.
Well, yeah, the politics of passing in the trans community are really complicated, and I don't want to speak to it in a specific way because I'm not part of that community, but that's definitely represented in the show.
Yeah, and we also see that with body image, where Candy gets read by Pray Tell at the ball for, like, not fitting a category properly because she's not big enough.
Well, because Candy usually walks in the face categories.
Yeah.
And Candy is a character who is kind of used to walk in different categories where she doesn't necessarily belong.
But because that's, like, she wants to. And she's challenging this idea that, like, realness in the balls means that you can pass.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what it originally meant, and that's how it's described in Paris is Burning, and that's how it's described in the first episode with Blanca explaining to Damon, and how she is like, well, but she and Angel also, because, like, she really wants Stan to like her. They both want to get, like, injections to make themselves have more curves.
They actually go for silicone injections.
Well, they go to, like, 2 different people, right? So the first one is someone who's, like, very respectable and everything, but they can't afford it.
It's also definitely an edge to it, where there's definitely, like, the politics of, like, we're giving this to you for cheaper, and, like, this is the stuff that the white people get.
Yeah, it's a black woman, yeah. And then they go to someone who's much sketchier, and it clearly has been doing it on herself, and, like, it just doesn't look right. Is that the best? I mean, it's like, again, it might be, like, exaggerated and played up, but it, like, she turns around, it's like this horror montage, and the Candy is like, well,
like the black market of body enhancement.
Yeah, exactly.
Which, I mean, I think is still, like, an issue of plastic surgery, because we have whole reality shows, like, dedicated to, like, botched plastic surgery.
Right, and then Candy ends up passing out at the ball and almost, like, getting sick. Because
it gets infected, and then she needs antibiotics.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's another issue about access and money and power and what you have to do to just gain respect from your community.
And I will also note, in terms of passing, like, Angel passes really well, Elektra passes, and then it's...
Right, and they talk about this. This is not, like, our judgment.
Yeah, no. Like, I just want to, like, this is, like, what's represented in the show, because Angel later on becomes a model and, like, that whole storyline. But it's season 2, so I'm not going to talk about it. And then... and that's why I'm also prefacing this, because in the show it's made out to be that Blanca is not as good as passing as the other women on the show.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of this show focuses on, like, the body politics of trans women and how their bodies are kind of used in different ways, either in the ball and trying to achieve realness, or trying to get enhancements to make passing easier, or in Angel and Elektra's case, doing sex work. So, and we talked a little bit about this before, but Angel works at the Piers.
Yes.
A trans sex worker, and Elektra, it's hinted at, has done that in the past. And then the two of them, at various points, also work at Show World in the booths. Mm-hmm. And this idea of the politics of different types of sex work, where doing work in motels and on the street is deemed more dangerous because there's more possibility for violence, and you actually have to touch people and engage in intimacy and practices that may or may not be as safe, versus being in a booth where just kind of exhibiting your body but not engaging in physical, intimate activity.
Yes.
And I just think it's really respectful how they do that, especially with all of the sex work legislation that's been passed recently that has limited the activity of online workers. My best friend in grad school wrote a whole thesis on that, so I've heard a lot.
Yeah. I mean, it really speaks to how, as you mentioned earlier, with Angel going for a job at Trump Tower and then being rejected, and she's like, wait, but, like, and she was rejected immediately just because of her appearance, and how there really aren't that many options, but also these people also need to live and work. Even if they, for the balls, you know, they steal some things sometimes.
And it's interesting, too, because you have people like Electra and Angel who do sex work, which is more lucrative for them, but so more dangerous. And then Pray Tell works at Macy's. And
Blanca is a manicurist.
Which doesn't pay super great.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how they subtly, like, provide commentary on the different job opportunities available and, like, the different levels. And that's why also Little Poppy is drawn to drug dealing, because it's easy money. Although, as he learns very quickly, it may not be worth all of the trouble and the social politics involved with that dealing.
Yeah.
Since we've talked about all of the storylines and the plot, I kind of wanted to transition from a micro perspective to a more macro perspective and a discussion about genre and form and what the show is doing on a larger level. So I read a lot of historical fiction, and I enjoy historical, like, period movies and TV shows, and I'm always interested in what historical fiction does and offers its audiences, and I think it's often multifaceted in terms of how people can respond to a show like this. Because in the Billy Porter interview, which we will link in the show notes, he talks about how since he started filming and being in this show, he's gotten calls, like, out of the woodworks of friends that he knew from this time period, calling him and reaching out about how they're doing, what they've been through, talking about survivor's guilt and all of these other issues. So I think in that one way, this show really caters to the audience that went through this and being able to see themselves represented. It appeals to trans people who maybe get to see themselves in a major TV show with a big budget for the first time, and not some kind of either overly tragic piece of media or something that's lower budget. But then I think it's also interesting to think about how historical fiction as a form is often used to take the issues of the past and the representation and the filmed memory of those incidents and then take them and bring them into the present moment and show how the representation of history often says more about the present moment that we're living in as opposed to the moment that they're representing itself. And I definitely think both are important, but I think it's interesting to think about how these conversations about queer rights, queer representation, transgender issues specifically, and this also comes up so much in season 2 with certain things that happened, and healthcare and all of these issues are things that are important for today, and also using historical fiction as a medium to pass history on to current generations in an accessible and appealing way.
Yeah, I will say to compare what I've been noticing, like, engagement-wise and who's talking about it on Twitter with this season versus last year, is that there's been a lot more, and I've seen more communities embrace it, and, like, different, publications geared towards not just the queer community and the trans community, but also Black and Hispanic and Latino or Latinx communities. So I think that's been picked up more to, like, learn about our history.
And there's multiple histories that intersect in this show.
Right, and that's why I think it's had that broad appeal.
And I also think it's interesting because we've been live tweeting season 2 to see, like, what kinds of people are interacting with our tweets about the show. And I've definitely noticed that it's a lot of young people of color who are very actively live tweeting, which I think tracks of Twitter as a social media site.
I was going to say, I feel like that's also the demographics.
But it's important, too, because it's free marketing for the show, too, when you have young people engaged in tweeting about the show as well.
Especially with the show being on a very popular network.
Yes.
That is cable, but widely available. I think, especially with this season 1 being released on Netflix to catch people up.
I was going to say, because Netflix especially gears towards a younger demographic as well.
Yeah. So, like, that comparison, because it's not like HBO where there's a paywall. As much of a paywall, at least.
And I feel like for that reason, HBO shows generally tend to, like, appeal to, like, white middle-class people in their...
I mean, not always. Like, Insecure is on HBO and stuff. But it's harder to be really seen. And even some of the lesser ones. Like, Lena Waithe has a show, but it's on, like, Showtime, I think, or Stars. And that's even lesser. subscribe to. So, yay for FX. And now Ryan Murphy's jumping ship to Netflix. But oh, and Janet Mock got a show picked up, too.
Yes.
As a result of this, basically.
And if you're interested in historical fiction about this time period and want a book about young people of color, read Like a Love Story by Abdi Nazemian.
Yeah, especially, like, season 2, because there's intersections with that season, because it takes place during the same year. I will say the show also leaning towards it being a week-by-week show, which I think basically Netflix has more of an issue with this, and that's why I'm glad it's on week-by-week, even though some other shows aren't great at the episodic nature of television now.
Olivia and I have very different perspectives on
We have different perspectives. I like episodes, okay?
I don't like episodes. Like, there were some plot lines that got dropped for, like, 5 episodes in season 1, and I'm like, why? Like, why is this coming up again now? And, like, why do we have to have these, like, neat little compartmentalized, like, plot lines in each week? It's so frustrating to me.
But the show thrives on, like, picking different themes for different episodes, and then, like, you get to see how that juxtaposes, even though it's, like, the same theme, how the themes of the episode relate to different characters, and, like, how, but in different ways, and that's, like, juxtaposed together.
I mean, no, I agree. I'm just saying, like, sometimes that works, like, really successfully, like, in Love is the Message, and sometimes it just falls flat for me. Like, even in season 2, there's been some episodes where I'm like, I kind of see where they're going with that, but, like, this episode just kind of feels, like, limp and useless to me.
I felt like that pretty strongly in the second episode, I think, of season 2, which I feel like you liked less than I did.
I hated that episode.
It was all about loving yourself. Okay.
I know, but it was, I don't know, the stakes weren't there, the plot movement wasn't there, it just fell flat.
This is a thing the show does that I like.
I mean, I like it when it does it well.
Yeah. Music? I don't know.
Oh, I wanted to talk about the music because in Billy Porter's interview, that's really good. So the interviewer was like, so Pose has really incredible music selections. And then they were talking about, like, how they got, like, certain songs because, like, the rights for the songs, like, you can tell, like, how massive of a budget this show has based on how killer the music is. So Billy Porter responded, you know, honey, when a network believes in you, they'll have the music that they'll spend their money on because she ain't the only one. You got Tina Turner, you got Janet Jackson, you got Diana Ross, you got Whitney Houston. Those songs are not cheap, honey. And then it was interesting because the interviewer was like, was there any song you knew the show had to have? And Billy Porter said there was I'm Coming Out by Diana Ross.
Yeah.
When they filmed that, they didn't have the rights. They were like, we want that, but we don't have the rights, so just dance to something. They gave us something that was similar in beat. So it's interesting how I think my whole thing with the music was just showing, like, how much of a budget the show has and how much the network supports it and gives them money to do things that are cool.
I guess this is a playlist, but basically a list of the songs on this. They have been releasing, and FX has done this with some of their other shows, like mostly Fosse Verdon, but they started releasing, like, official Spotify playlists based on episodes.
Mm-hmm. Since they have the rights for the songs, they might as well.
Yeah. And rights of songs are also complicated because if it gets picked up by streaming services or re-aired or something, there are famous instances where, like, songs have been cut because they didn't get the rights again, or, like, some things haven't been released, like, on DVD because they didn't have rights. So that's a complicated thing. But anyway, there's a lot of, like, classic music. And I will say, I know, like, I think, like, our generation sometimes complains about these lists. Oh, also Billy Porter and MJ Rodriguez and Indya Moore, and I think most of the cast, Dominique Jackson, made playlists of their favorite songs to, like, kind of themed, like the category is something, on Spotify too, which is fun to check out. Yeah, which is fun to check out.
We will link that on the show notes.
Okay, I'll find it. It was, like, for Pride this past month. But I think people like to complain how, like, these retro gay playlists are actually featuring, like, straight people. But if you look at the history and, like, gay icons similarly, if you look at the history, there's reasons. And they were really, like, allies. Like, back then, being an ally was a big deal. So they definitely made a difference, like Diana Ross and Madonna. And then also just disco, for instance, originated in gay clubs. And especially with people of color. And so that's why there's so much influence of that. And I like to see that history represented, even though we do have better representation now. But I'm glad that, and like more explicit representation. But I'm really glad that we get to experience that through the show.
Yeah. And again, something that historical fiction can do.
But I think also the focus on performance in a way, like not only have we talked about this being related to identity and politics and the whole ball scene, but also how there are like literally music performances in the show and dance performances. And that just really makes it special.
Well, yeah, because I totally cried when MJ and Billy Porter sang together.
Yeah.
Well, when Blanca and Prytel sang together at the AIDS Cabaret.
Mhm.
And they sang the song Home from The Wiz.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I also wanted to talk about the cinematography briefly for the show. I'm thinking the first moment that I realized that the way that they shot this show was truly special was the scene where Helena and Prytel are in the elevator together at the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't know who the other person is and how their lives intersect in a more personal way, but they're on the elevator together, and then they also had the connection that they're both going to the AIDS ward to visit people that they cared about who are dying. Because Helena goes to visit one of her former students who has a hallucination and then passes away later that day.
Yeah.
And then Prytel is visiting his lover, Costas, who's slowly passing away from AIDS-related complications and infections. And yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought the way that they shot that and like how there's certain moments in this show where...
Is that Love is a Message? Because if so, that was Janet Mock.
It might have been that episode. It was either that episode or the one right before it.
Mm-hmm.
And also,
I think it was that because I watched the one before it.
Yeah.
I think. Anyway.
But, and I think the show has also stepped up their cinematography game in season 2, especially with episode 4, if you haven't watched it yet.
Yeah.
And other people agreed with me because those tweets got a lot of engagement.
And now for a segment we call Tay's Academic BS for the episode.
So in thinking about this, did you add Butler or did I add Butler?
I added Butler.
Okay, I can talk about that.
I can also. I have some questions. So continue.
I took a theory seminar about French theory around the body, which was painful but also useful. And I also kind of schooled my whole class on, like, non-binary gender and, like, pronouns in general and, like, why, like, if it's likely that an artist was trans in the past, we should respect that and use the appropriate pronouns even though there's, like, different issues with that. Or we should, like, try to avoid pronoun use in those situations. That was a weird class for me. Anyway, so in preparation for this episode, I was thinking about a few academic sources that I really enjoyed that touch upon queer theory or are extremely, like, well-known pieces in queer theory, and then also affect theory, which is the small subsection of the humanities that I live in intellectually and academically. So the first is Munoz's Cruising Utopia, which is like the hallmark work of performance studies, which is a department that was started at Tisch at NYU. So in Cruising Utopia, the whole idea of this book is that queerness is a concept and an ideal that exists in the future and hasn't been reached. So everything about the...
I kind of like that idea.
So,
but continue.
I've read parts of it, but the idea is that queerness is a future-oriented concept where it's not something that we've reached yet, but everything we're doing is constantly striving towards it. And I think this show has that same future-oriented momentum and hope about striving towards an ideal and performing identity in that kind of orientation. And then another academic work that I was thinking about while watching the show was Lauren Berlant and Michael Warner's epic essay, Sex in Public, which talks about the urban zoning politics in New York in the 1990s, where they basically said sex-related businesses were restricted from operating except under very specific circumstances, and basically the consequences of this legislation was that a lot of the places that you see imposed and which fueled queer culture from existing in New York City were forced to shut down. Mm. And that had huge implications for ball culture and for different queer activities that were perceived to be...
Wasn't a lot of that in the 80s, like, around that time? Or, like, Giuliani, so, like, 90s?
Yeah, it was in the 90s mostly when the legislation got passed, but definitely there was crackdowns in the 80s as well, which you see when...
We'll talk about that a little bit in Season 2.
Yeah. So Season 2 of Pose deals more with gentrification in the city, and you kind of see in 1990 the beginnings of that, and real estate conglomerations who bought up real estate. And if you haven't been to New York City over, like, a long period of time, there's certain areas like the Bowery and the Lower East Side, which have historically been, like, more lower income people of color, artists, and other industries, and those areas are actually starting to gentrify right now and have been gentrifying over the past few years, which is terrifying. Like, as soon as the Whole Foods opened up on the Bowery, I was like, okay, this place is screwed.
Uh-oh.
And, like, that whole issue, and, like, what's been happening to Brooklyn, and what's happening to Long Island City and Queens, and all of these different issues all have its roots in the 90s. But, so in this article in Sex and Public, so Berlant and Warner are two queer academics, and they both have, like, a very interesting sense of humor. For the article, they go to a leather shop or a leather bar on Christopher Street, and they watch an erotic vomiting show.
I think you told me about this.
I told you about this. They were like, okay, we can stay until it gets messy, and then we'll leave. And, like, they kind of, like, low-key roast academia in this episode. But the whole idea is about the construction of heterosexuality, not as a stable identity, but as they argue that heterosexuality isn't an identity, it's a force of social control.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, some people are just great, but it's the way to which that permeates the culture.
Well, yeah, and, like, the way that society is set up to control things using this force of heteronormativity and heterosexuality and kind of focus on family and the implications that has for public space and for people to exist in physical spaces as well. So that's why I thought about Sex in Public. And we'll link it in the show notes so you can read it, all 35 pages of that.
Actually available, okay.
I mean, I can find it and link it. It's fine. That's how I found it in the first place. And then...
Yeah, Judith Butler. Well, I brought her up because I have studied her in literary theory. What did I read? What's her most famous thing? Because I probably read something from that.
Gender Trouble.
Yeah, it was an excerpt of that.
But then she had a follow-up to that called Bodies That Matter that focuses more on the body, and she kind of reneges a few things in Gender Trouble. But I haven't read that in a while, and I didn't prepare that for this episode.
No, that's okay. I literally edited this before we started recording.
But her whole idea...
Well, because I did read the part... Well, basically this is the origin of, like, gender as a social construct idea, at least from academia. But it's kind of limited. I found it quite limited in a way because it doesn't acknowledge that there is maybe an inner form of gender, which is part of the whole idea of transness in the first place. Or, like, I mean, I think people adopted this idea could undermine the trans rights movement, is what I'm saying.
She does renege that a little bit in Bodies That Matter, but I have to see. And some of her more recent work is definitely more inclusive. I just wanted to, like, pose that. But there's definitely still issues, and, like, academia in general and theory is generally detached from practice. Detached
from actual life.
Yeah.
And people they're talking about. But she does talk about drag in there, too, which isn't the same as trans people, but definitely connected to the ball culture. Because you can do drag if you're a trans woman. Many do. right, like, she talks about being the ultimate prestige, but she talks about, like, being a parody of, maybe, she says it's more of a parody of feminism, or femininity, it's more of a prestige.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering how some of this might relate, and her ideas of performativity of gender in general relate to this show, because it's definitely focuses, as we talked about, on performativity versus, like, juxtaposed with their real lives.
I mean, I think, and I'm going to go on an academic rant right now, so just prepare yourself.
Well, wait, I have one more thing I'm going to say before you do that, which is also with Stan and Angel, but the idea that he is also performing something, which I think he says, like, he doesn't know who he is because he's just kind of forced to be something in a way.
Yeah.
That society tells him to be, and he's not actually, he doesn't have any room to explore. And that's why he finds Angel so, like, free and intriguing to him.
And in terms of performance in academia, that reminds me so much of Goffman and symbolic interactionism, which kind of grew out of some of his ideas. But the idea of Goffman's faces and performing faces, the idea that you have, like, a true self, and you have the self that you have to perform for other people. And I think Stan's problem is that he gets way too invested in the self that he has to perform for other people to be who he thinks he has to be for his wife, for his boss, for Angel, that he doesn't have any concept of a true self, and that's what ultimately causes his existential crisis and demise at the end of season 1.
Yeah, seems accurate.
But back to Butler, so her whole idea of gender is that, her idea of gender is kind of that it doesn't exist either, but that it is reinforced through repetitive performances, actions, and ideas around language. So you constantly perform your gender in order to make your gender exist and be readable for other people, I think is her core idea of gender trouble and gender performativity. And it also very much relates to Foucault and Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1, where he argues that power, we're getting really deep in theory right now.
I don't like Foucault, but it's okay.
No, Foucault's good. Foucault's one of the good ones.
Well, except he bugged me a little bit. I guess I like him in general. It's just when he narrows it down, I'm like, it reads as like, his idea about labels I don't like as much. But
well, yeah. But I think his ideas about power are really on and influential. So his whole idea is that power comes from below, and this is why you need Foucault's context in order to make gender trouble make sense, is that Foucault's idea is power comes from below, so it's not people from the top kind of dictating things that you should do. Social control comes from the bottom and what you internally feel like you should do in order to belong in society. So that's why the interactions that people teach their kids and the gender normativity and heteronormativity that parents pass on to their kids is so harmful, and it also gets perpetuated in schools and other institutions of power.
It's my least favorite thing. Like gender reveal parties now, and I can't. And just the clothes I see.
Because the issue with gender is that we institute gender performance regulation from the moment that the sperm meets the egg, basically.
Yeah.
Because even the way that people treat perceived girl babies versus perceived boy babies is very different. And there was a study shown where they took the same baby, put it in a pink onesie, and the way that people treat girl babies is that they keep them very internally confined and kind of coddling them and not really giving them space or exposure to kind of understand or face their environment. So they tend to keep them face in towards the body, whereas they took the same baby and put it in a blue onesie, and then people would generally bounce the baby on their lap and keep the baby face out and give the baby more autonomy over where to look. So, like, from a very basic level of how we handle the bodies of babies, we reinforce gender performance, which ties into Foucault's idea of power coming from below. And then Judith Butler's kind of adaptation of Foucault's theory of power towards gender norms and how we reiterate gender norms through the performance of them in our everyday lives, and why it's so dangerous to cross those boundaries, which then ties into another academic I study, Sarah Ahmed, who talks about affect aliens and the idea of it's dangerous to effectively orient yourself in your environment in contrast to the people around you. And that's why you have, like, the tragic queer trope that has perpetuated, where it's this idea of people make being queer or being gender non-conforming an issue, so therefore it's perceived to be an issue instead of thinking about those repeated behaviors that make it an issue in the first place instead of, yeah.
Yeah.
So that was my academic rant.
Yay. Talk to us about Pose. We're enjoying the second season. We're confused about the time skip a little bit, but...
Yeah. So Pose season 1 was awesome. Please keep in mind that while Olivia and I both love Pose, we are not trans people of color. And while we talked about some trans issues in this show, you should really follow trans people of color to better understand things from their perspective. Luckily, there are a host of people who write and star on Pose that you can follow for this information. We encourage you to follow Janet Mock, Our Lady J, MJ Rodriguez, Indya Moore, Dominique Jackson, Angelica Ross, Hailie Sahar, and other trans activists in online spaces who can give you a more specific lens into these issues that are represented in Pose and continue to affect trans people living in today's world. Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Popped Open, and we hope that you'll continue to follow us on Twitter at CPO_podcast and Instagram at Culture Popped Open. If you want to follow us individually on Twitter, you can do so. You can follow Tay at TayBerryJelly and Olivia at Books and Big Ideas. Please check out the resources that we posted in the show notes, and also consider supporting our Patreon, which we are going to update soon with all kinds of perks and bonus content that you can enjoy. And we have a bunch of upcoming new episodes for you to look forward to. Thank you.